Hey, good morning, everyone. Josh of Severe Weather. Happy Friday to you. I'm a meteorologist in the Raleigh area with a degree from Penn State, 2003, independently working here on YouTube to help you all out with extreme weather. And we're primarily going to be talking about Hurricane Lee, which, if you haven't heard the news yet, rapidly intensified yesterday from Category 1 in the morning to Category 5 in the evening. So now into rare air, and the storm looks like it may not quite be finished intensifying, as we have what could end up being one of our top 10 strongest storms wind-wise here in the Atlantic Ocean. So some very impressive things going on this hurricane season between the record warm waters we have and right now some low wind shear. So let's talk about Lee, and we'll also talk about some other storms that are affecting other parts of the tropics here. But wind speeds expected this morning to strengthen up to about 180 miles per hour. It's possible it could even get a little bit higher than that. I'm not going to forecast 200 for sure, but we are definitely dealing with an intense storm, and one that is fortunately not going to be directly impacting land for several more days. But in an area of very warm waters and low wind shear, it will remain a very intense storm as it moves into the southwestern Atlantic. Now, as we get into later next week and the weekend, the eventual track of the system still needs to be kind of determined. A lot of forecasts have been taking this anywhere from New England into Atlantic Canada and just to the west of Bermuda, but still some changes possible in that. I don't think we're going to see the storm continuing west into Florida or the southeast. Just very little support for something like that happening. But this doesn't mean this system couldn't be dangerous farther up the East Coast in places that maybe aren't used to dealing with storms this intense. So here is what my forecast looks like, and we will have some fluctuations in intensity, but still likely to have a powerful hurricane well into the middle of next week, tracking generally west-northwestward, maybe even a bend back to the west, which you don't want to see in Florida and the Bahamas for sure. But there will come to a point where a trough moves into the eastern United States, and that picks the storm up and turns it rightward. But where that happens could be anywhere from just east of the Bahamas to just west of Bermuda. So my track right now, pretty much following where it's been the last couple of days, with eventual landfall somewhere near the Bay of Fundy or western Nova Scotia, possibly even tracking through eastern Maine. At that point, the storm will accelerate. This is probably, we're talking next weekend, sometime between Friday and Sunday. But will start weakening some, but as a big storm. So if you're in Atlantic Canada, you need to have your eyes glued on this system. If you're in New England, you need to watch as well. If you're in the rest of the Northeast and the Mid-Atlantic states, keep an eye on it, but I don't think you're going to get a direct impact, although certainly that could change. Meteorologist Brad Panovich from the Charlotte TV Market says he's going to be updating this. We'll probably have a top 10 intensity storm. Winds right now, as of this recording, are 165 miles per hour, predicted to get up to 180. So it's possible we could be ending up tied for fifth out of this storm. If it gets even stronger, tied for second. And the benchmark storm, as far as measured winds, is Hurricane Allen from 1980. I'm a little bit too young to remember that one, but certainly we are going to be in rare air. So probably a top 10 storm or just outside the top 10 if for some reason the storm begins to stop strengthening at this point. And the interesting thing here, this is from the Hell Belgherzi, I think. But for the first time ever, and this is a product of El Nino and warming waters, all 7 tropical cyclone basins have produced a Category 5 storm, and we're only in the beginning of September. In the South Pacific, we had Cyclone Kevin was a Category 5. In the Australian Indian Ocean, Ilsa earlier this year was a Category 5. Mocha in the northern Indian Ocean, that one eventually hit Bangladesh, India, and Myanmar. That was a 5 over water. It weakened before it hit. Mawar in the Western Pacific caused all kinds of damage from Guam over to Luzon in the Philippines. Hova just 2 days ago, really yesterday, was a Category 5, and now that one's finally weakening. Fortunately, not a threat to land. Lee, now in the North Atlantic, Category 5. It was a 1 this time yesterday. Winds strengthened almost 100 miles per hour in 24 hours. Very incredible to see. And of course, Freddie was the one back in the Indian Ocean that eventually hit Madagascar and Mozambique as a weakening major hurricane. Here's a look at what we have out in the Atlantic, and really just 2 storms of note. We also have a storm in the Pacific. That's Hova. Hova, a Category 2 hurricane now. It was a 5 about a day and a half ago. Lee, a Category 5 major hurricane. That's the one we're going to focus mostly on. And a new tropical storm, Margot. Why is the carpet wet, Margot? I don't know, Todd. But yeah, that one is likely going to be our next hurricane, and that is not looking like a threat here as it moves into the north central Atlantic. We also have the remains of Idalia now moving towards Newfoundland, but not really much of a circulation. And the remains of Franklin not becoming tropical, but certainly spinning up some rough surf here between Portugal and Ireland. In the Western Pacific, we do also have a weakening tropical storm that will pass just to the west of Tokyo, produce some gusty winds and heavy rain there, but not an immediate threat, and a disturbance that has passed Guam and the Marianas, which could slowly develop here in the Philippine Sea, but I'm not really going to talk about that today because it just doesn't look like a big threat. So in the Atlantic, here's kind of the full spectrum here. We have Idalia here, which of course hit Florida a little over a week ago, came off the East Coast, did some looping, came close to Bermuda, lost its tropical characteristics, then turned up towards Nova Scotia. I'll draw on the map kind of how it tracked so you guys can see. It formed down here near the Yucatan, came up through Cuba, came up, hit the Big Bend of Florida, and then off the Carolina coast, came down in here. Looked like it was going to try to loop back towards Florida or try to loop back this way. But instead, it decided it was going to go further out to sea and follow the trough like you normally would expect this time of the year. Came up close to Nova Scotia yesterday and then made a loop back out, and now it's moving over the Avalon Peninsula and we'll be heading out to sea, but not a big threat. We do not really have any other major systems to deal with in the Caribbean or Gulf, just a few clouds at this point, no organization. Really, the big storm on the map is Hurricane Lee. You can see these are the Leeward Islands. Lee is going to be continuing to track to the northeast of those islands here over the weekend and then move into the southwest Atlantic, where it should still be a powerful storm next week. Now, the storm track is expected to slow down, and because of that, we're going to be waiting on a trough that's going to move into the western U.S. this weekend and track into the eastern U.S. That's going to turn the system more to the northwest, and then eventually that trough should push it out to the northeast, but we don't know yet if that's going to happen over here, or it's going to happen over here, or if it takes a harder right and misses Atlantic Canada. The average of the model says it's going to be somewhere in the Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, or Maine area, but there's still uncertainty with it being still about 8 days away from potential landfall. We also have Margot, but that is not going to be a threat to land. Here is the remains of Katia, not going to be reforming. And, you know, aside from these two systems and really Lee, there isn't going to be much to talk about over the next week or so, if you want to call that good news. I don't know if we can call anything good news out of this. But here is a wide view, infrared view. This is tropicaltidbits.com, wonderful website. I encourage you to visit it and watch Levi's videos. He is a hurricane expert and a researcher with a PhD from Florida State, and it works over in the Honolulu office here with the Central Pacific Hurricane Center, I believe. But really, yeah, the one thing that sticks out is Lee. That's right here, moving west-northwestward. Then we've got Tropical Storm Margot, and then we've got another wave that's diminishing with one following it that we'll have to keep an eye on later next week. You can see the evolution here in the central Atlantic of Lee going back to yesterday. It formed an eye in the afternoon and strengthened to a Category 4 in the evening. A plane got in there at night and found that it was strengthening to a Category 5 by the second penetration of the storm. And it is really in a great environment to continue to hold its own here. The eye is actually tightened up a bit, which indicates that it's still strengthening. It is getting a little bit of wind shear off to the south and west over the next day. That may halt the intensification, but this system is very big and looks like it's going to overcome wind shear and remain very powerful. In the eastern Atlantic, other than this low-level circulation with Katia, which really isn't worth even mentioning more than 10 seconds here, we do have Tropical Storm Margot, which is now passing to the west of the Cape Verdes, and that is likely going to start turning more to the north and west after this upper-level low leaves the area, after Katia leaves the area, and high pressure builds in between these two systems. Another wave coming off of Africa does not look like it'll develop, excuse me, but there is a bigger one over Central Africa that some models show eventually developing as it gets closer to where Lee is, but that's not going to be probably for another 10 to 12 days. Sorry about all this drawing here. If I could find something better to draw with, I will. Anyway, here is the, you can see how the size of Lee has grown. It's not a massive storm when it comes to tropical storm strength yet, but I think it does get there next week. But we do have some very intense winds here in the hurricane, in the area of hurricane force winds. And fortunately, that looks like it's going to stay off to the north and east of the islands. You can see here's our storm track, and the storm is growing. It will continue to grow. Wind speed probabilities, though, for tropical storm force are relatively low on Puerto Rico and the northern Leeward Islands. There's a small chance we could see in the Virgin Islands and northern Leeward Islands a tropical storm watch, depending on how big the system gets. Right now, I think the chances are a little bit too low to see much significant tropical storm force winds. So some good news there. Now we have another plane that's going to be heading into Lee this morning that's going to give us an update. The aircraft last night, and I'm going to show you here, you can see, whoops, I'll get back to that. You can see the aircraft last night showed a west-northwesterly track. It went through the eye 4 times. This is the pressure. 936 millibars was the first reading. The advisory from a couple hours before had it at 950, so the pressure clearly dropped quickly right on into yesterday evening, and still dropped more slowly overnight into the 928 millibar range. The pressure surrounding it's pretty high, so 928 millibars is the strongest pressure we've seen in the Atlantic Basin since Hurricane Dorian, if you remember that, back in 2019, east of the Bahamas. So a very powerful storm here. The other thing you'll notice are these colored wind barbs here showing 137 knot flight level winds, which is about 160 to 170 miles per hour. We started to see those just on the eastern side of the storm in the first penetration. And then on the last pass, obviously, the winds continued to climb in intensity. And here's a look at what the recon measured. And I know this looks kind of challenging, so I'll just break it down for you guys real fast. It measured estimated surface winds of over 150 knots, which is 180 miles per hour. Now, there's some tainting to that data and a little bit of suspect data, but using that and the flight level wind speed of 150 knots, they estimated surface winds were 160 miles per hour, and still some strengthening ongoing. The sea level pressure in the 920s, a very intense storm. And another interesting thing here too is as they penetrated the eye, going through that warm center, they measured temperatures of as high as 28 degrees Celsius, which is 82 Fahrenheit. So they went through the eye and measured 82 degrees temperature and a dew point down to 32, a very dry, warm eye, which is a sign of a very intense storm and a very healthy storm. So that is something, we look at winds, obviously, but we have to look at how the eye is structured here to see how intense a storm we really are dealing with. And that is very impressive. We don't see that too often in our lifetime here. So yeah, very, very interesting system. Here's a look at the evolution, and I'm going to take it back just a 24-hour loop for you guys to see what it looked like yesterday morning. The eye was starting to form a little bit. The area of cloud cover continued to grow, and you can see this just these bright colored clouds, very intense, large eye. And then as we got to the nighttime, the eye did start shrinking, which, believe it or not, is a sign of intensification. You see the big eye and you think, oh, wow, that's a massive storm. But in the last few frames, you can see that it's actually shrinking. It may be starting to get impacted a little bit by wind shear, so we're going to have to wait and see what the plane finds later this morning. But the official forecast is 180 miles per hour. So it may actually be reaching its peak here this morning and then could level off this afternoon. We'll have to wait and see about that. Nonetheless, just a very incredible storm. And let's see here. I'm going to try to get you guys the latest visible satellite so that you can see sunrise here over Lee. And you can see my video is running very early, 6 in the morning, but the sun has just come up. You can see some very intense, very cold, high cloud tops around the center, but a little bit of cirrus overflow here in the center. So it is actually starting to fill in a little bit. That doesn't mean the storm's really weakening. It just means there's a little bit of wind shear, which is pushing some high clouds over the center. Still a very intense storm. So yeah, obviously we've got ourselves a monster on our hands here. Predicted to be 180 miles per hour by the National Hurricane Center. I was predicting a Category 5 a few days ago. They have come up to that. They're a little bit stronger based on recent model trends. I don't know if it's going to really get up to 200. I think that's a little insane, but 180 seems reasonable. And then it should level off. There'll be some fluctuations. We may go back and forth between 4 and 5 until we get to about Tuesday. And then we should start to see a little bit of weakening as we lose some of this higher heat content where these hashed lines are. The water temperatures start cool off a bit in here. So it'll still be a strong storm. I mean, 140 miles per hour is nothing you want to mess with, but it won't be as strong as what it's going to be here today. So a little bit of good news there. And you can see the track here is going to be generally west-northwest, some bending back to the left, and then a little bit more of a bend to the right as it passes Puerto Rico and tracks well to the east of the Bahamas. Intensity forecast shows from this morning, we will probably start leveling off here a little bit stronger, maybe in the next 12 to 24 hours. And then we should see gradual weakening. But this is still a forecast that is a little bit uncertain as the storm fluctuates, as the eye wall may get replaced and it may grow. There is a possibility of another intensification phase here coming over the weekend, but that's just so difficult to predict at this point. You can see the ship's forecast no longer shows rapid intensification. We've pretty much gotten to that point now. There is still a potential maximum intensity over the weekend of close to 200 miles per hour. That's at its very strongest. More than likely, it's somewhere between 160 and 180. Wind shear has climbed a little bit today, so that's probably going to halt our intensification. But then tomorrow into Sunday, the wind shear drops off to zero. We may see another phase of intensification, and water temperatures actually are a little bit warmer where this storm is going to track. So we may see one more burst coming here over the weekend. Again, doesn't really change where this storm goes. It just is there for record keeping at this point, being well over the waters. Relative humidity is actually expected to climb as we get to next week. So there will still be an environment that fosters an intense storm, but water temperatures do start dropping down as we get closer to the area south and western Bermuda that was hit by Franklin here a couple weeks ago. And as a result, the heat content does drop off. And that means we probably no longer have an environment that would support a strong Category 4, Category 5. Don't get wrapped up too much in that. I think our system grows to the point where even if it's a Category 2 or 3, it's going to be an intense storm. It's going to be a bigger storm than what it is now. Now, our storm tracks, you can see overall, we're actually going to see a bend back to the left as high pressure builds westward. That is something, if you're watching in Florida, you don't like to see. However, beyond 5 days from now, 120 hours, the majority of the models do start to show that ridge does eventually shift back to the north and east, and a trough pushes the storm more on a northerly path. Now, where that turn happens is very critical for Bermuda. It's also critical for the mid-Atlantic and northeast coast and Atlantic Canada. So until we get closer to about here, we aren't going to have a huge amount of confidence in where the exact track of the storm goes. So don't focus yet on every single shift in the models. Just watch the trends at this point and know that this is still 8 to 9 days away. Overall, ensemble trends were left yesterday, now back to the right just a bit today, but still a system that could impact Bermuda and could impact New England based on what we're seeing here. The GFS ensembles are still spread out quite a bit here. Other than a couple of outliers, it probably remains nearer to the west of Bermuda. There are some ensembles that are still clustered a lot closer to the North Carolina coast. You know, that is something I'm going to have to watch for you guys here. But if you take the mean here and you take the deterministic, the storm track is going to be into Nova Scotia, which could be very bad, of course, for Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island, and eastern New Brunswick. But still several ensembles west of that, meaning we're going to still be watching closely here in the northeast and New England, and some that are to the east, which would be our best case scenario, except if you live in Bermuda. The European ensembles have overall started to shift more to the right. I don't know if this is correct or not. We'll have to see. A lot of it's going to have to do with the timing of our system. But what I will say is, as this storm continues to grow in size, what often happens is it releases more and more heat into the atmosphere, all that latent heat that gets released. And what that can do is actually strengthen the ridge of high pressure around it. It can lead to a stronger high. And the stronger that high gets, the farther west this could still be. So what we're really going to have to wait and see is where our trough is going to be later next week in the northeast. If the trough doesn't build in quickly enough, or if this ridge gets stronger in here, it's going to try to maybe pull the storm more northward or even north-northwestward, even one track into Long Island, which is not being shown on all the ensembles, but it is still somewhat of a possibility. But several more tracks still going close by Cape Cod into Maine and New Brunswick, and quite a few still clustered over western New Brunswick. So just because the European has shifted a bit right doesn't necessarily mean that we need to rule this thing out as being an issue for New England or even Nova Scotia. It's just a trend that we're going to be monitoring. Every model says this storm is going to be in the 900s or 910, so it may not be done strengthening just yet. Here's a look at the ensembles, and you're going to see the spread here as we get on into the weekend. And it's not super big. This is pretty good forecast confidence. But then things start getting more challenging once we get to next Tuesday. We see a slowing of our storm and more of a spread in guidance from near the Turks and Caicos to south of Bermuda. So there is some growing uncertainty as we get to about the middle of next week as our storm slows down. And while the average of the models makes the right turn, there's still several ensemble members that are slower on that turn. And if that happens, then obviously this is more of a concern for the eastern seaboard. If it's faster on that turn, then Bermuda could get directly hit. So still a bit of uncertainty here by Tuesday and Wednesday, and then growing uncertainty by Thursday and Friday of next week. As a forecaster, I like to stick to my gut here until I see a massive shift on everything. I don't like to change things. But what I will tell you here as we get towards the end of next week is that this is still quite a bit of model spread and a lot can still change. So this forecast is tentative at this point. The ensemble forecast confidence very high over 48 hours, and then a moderate amount of guidance spread. So the confidence is moderate. It's not super high at this point once we get to this time next week. However, what I will say is that the typical error guidance, the typical spread here is less than average. So the confidence level here is more than you would expect on a 7-day forecast, less spread than what you typically see, but there is still spread. And so that confidence is not super high. So things can still change. Water temperatures are very warm here over the area of the Atlantic. The system is going 29 to 30 Celsius. That's mid 80s Fahrenheit. As the storm turns northwestward, it does get into cooler water. The wake, the coolest water west of Bermuda is there. If it avoids that, it may not weaken quite as quickly and may go closer to the Gulf Stream. By the time it gets up towards eastern New England or towards Atlantic Canada, those waters drop off below 20 Celsius, and the system will weaken and start to lose some tropical characteristics. But it's moving quicker at that point too, so it has less time to weaken than a typical storm. Versus the average, yes, we are well above average, 2 to 3 degrees Celsius, even more in some places here where the system is going. That's why it strengthens so quickly. It'll get to a point here by the middle of next week where the water temperatures are near or just below average, but they're still pretty warm. And this is due to the fact that Franklin used up a lot of the very warm waters here. So the system does have a chance of going over that cooler wake, but then it could emerge back into some warmer water temperatures with respect to average. Again, that's with respect to average. So let's look at the players on the map here. Here is the upper level ridge that's going to drive this system west-northwest. Here's a trough moving into the southeastern United States. And oh, by the way, we have a strengthening Margot, which could impact the shape of this ridge as well. So we do have to watch Margot and see what that one does, even though it's not going to be as big as Lee here. So our high pressure ridge is still well intact here over Bermuda on Monday, and that keeps the system on a west-northwest track and slows it down. Now that ridge is expected to shift northeastward here, but if Margot comes west, this ridge could actually end up a little farther west and push the speed of this trough back. That is what we don't want to see on the eastern seaboard. But if this trough is stronger and cuts more to the right, then our system will eventually make a right turn, and maybe a pretty significant right turn. So we have to track this upper low and then the system behind it on Friday and next Saturday to see where eventually the storm goes. We also have to track this ridge, because if Margot goes farther west, the ridge gets pushed west, and that pushes everything back to the west towards the eastern seaboard. So we still have a lot of uncertainty here. And then here's our next wave, by the way, which could end up being Nigel, and we'll have to see where that ends up going. A lot of uncertainty on that, and it's still a couple weeks away. So stay tuned on that. Here's the GFS surface forecast. You can see our two storms, kind of an ugly face here, two big eyes and kind of a frowny looking nose. Pretty crazy. I put a post on my community page last night about that. But these two storms keep enough of a distance where they're not going to merge into anything. They're going to be at least 1,000 miles away. But how far west Margot goes does dictate how this ridge ends up interacting here with the eventual track of Lee. The GFS, interestingly, has shifted west while the Euro shifted east. They've almost kind of reversed trends on each other. The GFS says this storm is going to hit Nova Scotia and go even over eastern New Brunswick and Prince Edward Island. The European has shifted to the right some and is now making a close call to Nova Scotia, but actually a faster recurve. You know, we may still be dealing with Margot here even a week and a half from now as a hurricane, and then once that moves out of the way, then maybe potentially a Nigel here coming through the Lesser Antilles or staying east of the Lesser Antilles. And just so much uncertainty at this point. We don't know where that's going to end up going. So just stay tuned on that. The European here has shifted right again after Wednesday, and you can see it is no longer threatening Maine and New Brunswick with a direct landfall. It actually turns the storm out to sea, which would be wonderful to see. But I don't necessarily believe that. And the reason why is Lee is stronger than modeled, and because of that, it's going to strengthen the ridge, all that heat release. And I don't think this ridge will be as weak as what it shows. So I like the GFS more than I do like the European for this particular run. And that again could still change. Here's the control of the European. You can see the right turn, and again, just a hard right. And gosh, I mean, if that hangs out, we may still have something to deal with here well into late the following week. The control does not develop Nigel over this area. It actually develops the one behind it. Again, this is the 22nd, who knows? Here's the Canadian model, though, which is kind of in between where all the other models are. And you can see it actually is a middle of the road storm, but look at how far west the Canadian takes this system. It goes just east of Cape Cod with eventual landfall in Maine here. So the Canadian would be worst case scenario for New England. While the European showed this yesterday, it has backed off. The Korean model showing something like this. So very much New England is still in play at this point. So keep an eye on that. This is interesting. We've got Lee, Margot, and Nigel here kind of lined up like soldiers here on the front line. So anyway, let's look at the Canadian because it's the worst case scenario, I believe, at this point. And it brings 41 mile per hour wind gusts onto Nantucket and 40 mile an hour wind gusts onto Cape Cod and Martha's Vineyard here by Friday night of next week. And then those winds build up closer to Boston on the South Shore, up to 50 miles per hour Saturday morning, and then moving into eastern Maine, 70 to 80 mile per hour wind gusts here by Saturday. So the Canadian's kind of the worst case scenario here for eastern New England and Atlantic Canada. That's something we'll be watching. If you're in New York City and in the mid-Atlantic, it could be windy. The surf could be rough, but I don't think we get a direct impact. Now looking at Atlantic Canada, kilometers per hour, this is where things get potentially really nasty here. Starting Saturday morning, we see gusts to 75 kilometers per hour on the southwestern tip of Nova Scotia, and then gusts over 110 kilometers per hour over the western part of Nova Scotia, 106 kilometers per hour in both Halifax and on Prince Edward Island. And in places like St. John's, gusts may get closer to 100 kilometers per hour, Moncton 80 to 90 kilometers per hour, and just some really intense wind if the Canadian track is right. The Euro, of course, swings it right, and that doesn't hit. The Canadian goes right over, the GFS in between the two. Either way, I think we're looking at some intense wind. Now, looking at the tropical model, how strong will this get? Well, the HAFS shows that the pressure is actually coming up a little this morning into the 930s, but then dropping back into the 920s and then into the 9-teens here overnight tonight into tomorrow, with its strongest intensity showing 910 millibars and wind speeds in excess of 180 miles per hour. Knots is actually 15% lower than miles per hour, so we may get it to 180 here if this is right. That'd be tomorrow afternoon. And pressures remain in the 9-teens, and they come up a bit and then they drop right back. One thing I did want to point out, though, is that the wind field is growing in size. So the models are actually showing some wind shear on the western side here that limits a bit of that outflow, and then the wind shear starts dropping off and the storm starts growing. So not only is it strengthening again, but it's growing in size. And that continues through Sunday before the storm system starts to slowly weaken, but the wind field continues to expand. And it shows a Category 5 again here on Monday afternoon, with weakening not really beginning here until we get to about Tuesday morning as the eye gets bigger and we start reaching some slightly cooler water at that point. But it's still growing, and we still have an intense storm, which will be a Category 4 right through Tuesday night before it starts to weaken. Here's a look at the simulated infrared. You can see that narrow eye starts to grow a bit, and then we start to see the size building in both the eye and in the outflow of this storm. And look how big it gets here Sunday night and Monday. Just a very intense storm system. Even though it may weaken some, it is still going to be a very big system here. We start to see a little bit of wind shear and a little bit of dry air trying to get into the southwestern part of this Tuesday night, and that could begin our trend of weakening here. Now, I've seen some people talking about the 1938 New England hurricane, and this track is actually kind of similar to it. It's stronger right now than the 38 storm was, but the turn is coming a lot more to the left of where our models show it. So I don't think it hits New England and Long Island directly. It could clip by, but this track is farther to the west than what we're looking at. And part of the reason this was such a big storm is that it moved at 58 miles per hour, and that allowed the storm to just weaken a lot more slowly. So I don't think we're seeing a repeat of this because of the forward motion being twice the speed of this 38 hurricane than this will be here with Lee. Lee's going to be moving probably 20 to maybe 25 miles per hour by the time it gets up into here. So I don't think we see a repeat, but it's something that I'm watching. And from Unisys, you can see that the average track for storms that hit New England is a lot farther west than what I think our storm's going to be, probably by about 300 miles. So Not saying Eastern New England couldn't get hit, but climatologically, this is not a favored track versus what we typically see, and that's a storm that comes up through the Outer Banks and the Mid-Atlantic states. Real quick, let's look at Tropical Storm Margot, and certainly harassing Todd over here. No, I'm just kidding. But it is a storm that is growing in size, but has not yet established a very good core. But you can see on the visible, those storms are beginning to erupt. So I think we're going to see intensification here and likely a hurricane by the end of the weekend, up to 90 miles per hour, possibly even stronger. But it is making a right turn and moving into some cooler water. The intensity forecasts are as strong as Category 2 or 3, but the average is Category 1. So that's where the Hurricane Center has it. And we do see less than 10% chance of this thing really going to town. But if it does, then certainly we could see wind speeds that get up to Category 3 intensity. Wind shear drops off as well next week for a little bit, but so do water temperatures. So yeah, it has a window to become a major hurricane, maybe our 4th of the year, but it should stay well over waters and not be a threat here. You can see that track turns to the right and it goes more northerly, and then there could be some uncertainty beyond that. Looking at the European ensembles, interestingly, they try to bring Margot farther to the north and west and may try to threaten Newfoundland here, but this would be 9 to 10 days from now. In the Pacific, Hurricane Hova is weakening, still a pretty big size storm, but not nearly as strong as it was a day and a half ago, down to Category 2 at this point, and not a threat to land. You can see it'll be down to tropical storm strength by Saturday and a remnant low by early next week. And then severe weather was pretty big in the Northeast yesterday. We saw a lot of nasty wind and some hail, really nasty storms as well around Charlotte, Columbia, Augusta, and down into Southeast Louisiana. Today is going to be another busy day in many of these same areas, with a slight risk in place from Northern Virginia up into Western Maine, and also a slight risk across East Texas, Western Louisiana, and the Ark-La-Tex. Not really a tornado threat in any of these areas, but certainly intense winds are possible as well as large hail. So be prepared for those, as we'll likely see watches starting this afternoon. Thank you all so much for your time today. I hope you have a blessed day. If you are a new viewer, or if you're just joining for the first time, please consider subscribing, as I give you daily videos for the most part. And if you have been a subscriber, or you've been certainly somebody who's been watching a lot of videos, if you'd like, and if you'd like to support me, I'm just going to ask $9.99 a month of a commitment. If you feel led to, of course, no pressure on that. But if you want to see more content, if you want more attention and more tailored forecasts, just a little bit more perks, I do have that option for you. Some folks have joined already, and I appreciate you all for joining. And just 33 cents a day is all I'm asking as far as that kind of commitment. But yeah, I just, my jaw drops when I see a storm like this strengthen so quickly. I can't say I was not expecting it, but it happened at a stronger rate than I think anybody would have predicted. But we have a major storm that's going to be around for quite some time here. So I thank you for your time today. I hope you all have a wonderful end of the week and weekend. I give all the glory to God, who has given me this calling here to be a meteorologist and to share with you all. And as a Christian man, I cannot go on another day doing this without thanking Jesus Christ. Matthew 20:18-20, King James Version, and Jesus came and spake unto them, saying, all power is given unto me in heaven and in earth. Go ye therefore and teach all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Ghost, teaching them to observe all things whatsoever I have commanded you. And lo, I am with you always, even unto the end of the world. Amen. We don't know when the world is ending, but we know that God has sent Jesus Christ as our Savior to save us so that we can live eternally and that we can share that wonderful gift with others. We are, as Christians, commanded to teach all and to share. And that's the reason I share with you every day that I'm a Christian, because that is what's been called upon me as a believer. If you don't believe, look, I'm not throwing it in your face. This is not an altar call or anything like that. This is just sharing what's most important to me and what matters the most. The weather is important, but what really matters is where we go after our short time here on earth. Whatever happens to the end of the world, we cannot predict, but we do know Jesus is coming again. And you do have that choice to accept Jesus as well as your Savior, because God has created all of us. He sent Jesus to die on the cross for us, and he's given us that gift that can wipe away all of our sins, all of our debt, and give us that eternal, priceless gift. So I wanted to share that great news with you today, and I hope you all have a safe afternoon. We'll talk again tomorrow morning. God bless you.